Good evening, and welcome to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward, speaking softly to you as the day finally releases you. Sleep is not an achievement. It's a gentle surrender. If you like, you can tell me in the comments whether you hear the final line, or fall asleep somewhere in between. You're warmly invited to subscribe if these stories accompany your nights. Now, settle back, and let the mystery carry you into dreams. Chapter 1. A Season of Expected Courtesies. There are towns in England where Christmas arrives not with the boisterous clamour of bells or the sudden bloom of festive greenery, but rather with the quiet, deliberate unfolding of custom. Ravensbrook was such a town. It lay nestled in a valley where the hills seemed to lean inward, as if listening to the soft conversations of its inhabitants, and where the river that bore its name moved with such patient dignity that one might suppose it had learned discretion from the people who dwelt upon its banks. In the days approaching Christmas, the good people of Ravensbrook applied themselves to the observance of the season with an earnestness that might have appeared excessive to a stranger, but which was, to themselves, merely the natural expression of their regard for propriety. Doors were polished until they gleamed with a lustre that seemed to announce the moral rectitude of those within. Greetings were rehearsed with such care that no deviation from the established formula could possibly introduce awkwardness or offence. Even the snow, when it fell, appeared to understand its duty, settling with decorative precision upon rooftops and window ledges, as though it too had been instructed in the art of contributing to harmony without causing disruption. It was in this atmosphere of orderly anticipation that we make the acquaintance of Mr. George Whitcomb, a gentleman whose profession it was to assist the inhabitants of Ravensbrook in their pursuit of knowledge, or at least in their pursuit of those volumes which might lead to knowledge, should they choose to open them. Mr. Whitcomb served as clerk at the town's reading room, a modest establishment situated on the high street between the haberdasher's shop and the offices of Mr. Threadwell the solicitor. The reading room was not grand, nor was it particularly well appointed, but it possessed that quality of quiet usefulness which endears a place to those who have learned to value substance over spectacle. Mr. Whitcomb himself was a man of perhaps 45 years, though his face bore no particular marks of those years, beyond a certain gentleness about the eyes that suggested he had spent them in observation rather than in struggle. He was neither tall nor short, neither stout nor thin, and his manner of dress was so perfectly unremarkable that one might pass him in the street a dozen times without retaining any clear impression of his appearance. Yet those who frequented the reading room knew him well, and knew him with that particular warmth which attaches itself to persons who perform small kindnesses without ceremony or expectation of recognition. If a volume could not be located, Mr. Whitcomb would discover it. If a reference eluded a reader's grasp, he would supply it with such quiet efficiency that the recipient might almost believe they had found it themselves. If a visitor to the town sought direction or assistance, they would invariably be told to inquire of Mr. Whitcomb at the reading room, for he knew not only where everything was to be found, but also how to convey that information without making the inquirer feel their ignorance had been burdensome. On this particular December morning, with Christmas Eve but one day distant, Mr. Whitcomb arrived at the reading room at his customary hour, removed his modest coat and hung it upon its accustomed peg, and set about the business of arranging the periodicals which had arrived with the morning post. The fire had been lit by Mrs. Godwin, the housekeeper, and the room had achieved that perfect temperature which invites contemplation without inducing somnolence. As he worked, Mr. Whitcomb's thoughts turned, as they often did at this season, to the various inhabitants of Ravensbrook and their preparations for the holiday. He thought of Mrs. Lydia Perrin, whose arrangements for the Christmas festivities had, over the years, become something of a standard by which other arrangements were measured. Mrs. Perrin was a widow of considerable capability, possessed of that particular energy which some women discover in themselves once they are freed from the daily negotiations of matrimony. Her late husband, a gentleman of business whose endeavours had been more enthusiastic than profitable, had departed this world some 7 years previous, leaving Mrs. Perrin with a comfortable house, a modest income, and an abundance of time which she devoted to the improvement of Ravensbrook's social life. It was Mrs. Perrin who organised the Christmas assembly, Mrs. Perrin who determined which families would be invited to which gatherings, and Mrs. Perrin whose approval was sought before any significant social arrangement could be considered properly established. She performed these duties with such gracious authority that the town had long since ceased to question her right to do so, and had indeed come to rely upon her judgments as one might rely upon the changing of the seasons. Mr. Whitcomb also thought of Reverend Alistair Monk, whose gentle sermons and conciliatory disposition had made him beloved of his congregation, even if his theological insights were not always as profound as one might have hoped. The Reverend was a man who believed deeply in the healing power of peace, and who had developed over his years of service a remarkable facility for smoothing over difficulties before they could ripen into disputes. If two parishioners found themselves at odds, the Reverend could be counted upon to discover some interpretation of events which would allow both parties to feel they had been understood and vindicated. If a disagreement arose over parish matters, he would inevitably propose a solution so perfectly balanced that neither side could claim victory, and thus neither could feel defeated. This talent for preserving harmony had made Reverend Monk indispensable to Ravensbrook, where the appearance of accord was valued above almost all other social virtues. Yet there were moments, had one been observant enough to notice them, when a certain weariness could be detected in the Reverend's expression, as though the constant effort of maintaining peace had begun to exact a toll which he was too conscientious to acknowledge. The morning passed quietly in the reading room. Mr. Whitcomb assisted an elderly gentleman with the Times, helped a young scholar locate a volume of Burke's writings, and spent a pleasant quarter-hour discussing the prospects for snow with the postmaster who had stopped by to deliver a small parcel of correspondence. By noon, when the winter sun had achieved its modest height and cast a pale light through the reading room's windows, Mr. Whitcomb had every reason to believe that Christmas would proceed in Ravensbrook as it always had, with grace and good order, and all those small observances which make a season pleasant without making it memorable. He had no reason as yet to suppose that anything would arrive to disturb this comfortable anticipation. He could not have known, as he had arranged the volumes on their shelves, and tended to the fire, and performed all those small duties which constituted his daily existence, that a letter was even then making its way toward Ravensbrook, a letter bearing an old hand and an unfamiliar seal, a letter that had waited many years to be delivered, and which would, when it arrived, ask the good people of this orderly town to remember something they had long since learned to forget. But such knowledge was not yet his, and so Mr. Whitcomb continued with his work, content in the belief that Christmas in Ravensbrook would be exactly as Christmases in Ravensbrook had always been, neither more nor less remarkable than the steady, decent passage of days which had preceded it. Chapter 10. When the stir settled into peace. There are conclusions which arrive with the finality of a door closing, and there are conclusions which arrive with the gentler quality of a book being carefully set aside, its story complete but its lessons continuing to resonate. The resolution of the matter concerning Mrs. Fletcher belonged to this latter category. The questions had been answered, the acknowledgments made, and the practical reforms instituted, yet something of the experience remained active in the consciousness of the town, shaping how people thought about themselves and their obligations to one another. As February gave way to March, and the first hints of spring began to make themselves known in the lengthening days and the brave appearance of early crocuses, Ravensbrook settled back into its accustomed rhythms. The reading room resumed its quiet operations, with Mr. Whitcomb attending to his duties with the same unobtrusive efficiency. The parish meetings followed their established schedule, though there was now a new attention to detail in how charitable matters were recorded, and the various inhabitants went about their lives with that mixture of continuity and change which characterizes communities that have learned something important about themselves. Yet there remained one piece of unfinished business. It had been agreed that the parish should write to Mrs. Fletcher's daughter, whose Christmas correspondence had set all these events in motion. The letter should acknowledge what had occurred, express gratitude for her reminder, and convey assurance that steps had been taken to prevent future oversights. The composition proved more difficult than anticipated. Several drafts seemed either too formal or too casual, too defensive or too apologetic. It was finally determined that Mr. Whitcomb should compose the final version. He undertook this task with characteristic thoroughness, spending several evenings carefully crafting sentences that would convey truth without harshness, acknowledgement without self-pity, and commitment without empty promises. When he presented his draft to Reverend Monk, the older man read it through twice before setting it down with quiet satisfaction. "This is exactly what is needed," the Reverend said. "You have managed to be honest without being cruel, and hopeful without being presumptuous." The letter was copied onto proper stationery, signed by Reverend Monk and Mrs. Perrin, and dispatched with care. In it, they acknowledged that a promise had been made and imperfectly kept. They expressed gratitude for Mr. Whitcomb's intervention. They conveyed their sorrow that Mrs. Fletcher had not lived to see her family's circumstances improve, but their gladness that she had at least known some measure of support during that difficult winter. And they pledged, in terms both specific and sincere, that the lessons of this episode would guide the parish's future conduct. A reply came, some weeks later, written in a hand that showed both education and care. Mrs. Catherine Morton thanked the parish for their acknowledgement and expressed appreciation for Mr. Whitcomb's kindness to her mother. "My mother spoke often of Mr. Whitcomb in her final years," the letter concluded. "She said that he had shown her what kindness looked like when offered without expectation of recognition. That lesson has guided my own conduct, and I hope it may continue to guide the parish. I bear no ill will toward Ravensbrook, and I am heartened to learn that my letter has led to reflection and reform." When this letter was shared with the parish, there was a collective sense of relief, as though a weight carried for months had finally been set down. The matter was truly concluded now, not merely in terms of facts established and procedures reformed, but in terms of human understanding and forgiveness. Mrs. Morton had offered the parish what it most needed, the assurance that honest acknowledgement and genuine reform were sufficient response to past failure. In the weeks that followed, life in Ravensbrook continued with pleasant predictability. Spring advanced with customary determination. The trees along the high street displayed their new leaves, and the gardens began to show the fruits of winter planning. Mr. Whitcomb continued his work at the reading room, though he now found himself regarded with new respect by his fellow townspeople. It was not the ostentatious respect accorded to wealth or position, but rather the quieter appreciation given to those whose character has been tested and found sound. People greeted him with particular warmth, and when matters of charity were discussed, his opinion was sought with deference that would have been unthinkable before Christmas. He bore this altered regard with the same modesty he had always displayed, neither preening under the attention nor rejecting it with false humility. He simply continued to be himself, which was perhaps the greatest lesson he offered, that virtue is not a performance but a practice, not something one displays but something one lives. Mrs. Perrin, too, seemed altered by the experience, though the change was subtle. She remained as energetic and capable as ever, but there was a new thoughtfulness in how she approached her undertakings, a willingness to question whether good intentions were being matched by effective actions. As for Reverend Monk, he found that the entire experience had deepened his understanding of what it meant to lead a congregation. The letter and its aftermath had taught him that moral leadership sometimes required the uncomfortable work of helping people see truths they would rather avoid, and that peace achieved through honest confrontation was more durable than peace maintained through careful avoidance. And so the spring progressed, and summer followed, and the letter that had arrived so unexpectedly that Christmas became part of Ravensbrook's history, one of those stories that would be told and retold in years to come, always with the essential truth intact, that a community had failed in its duty, had been reminded of that failure, and had chosen to respond with honesty rather than defensiveness, with reform rather than excuses. The reading room flourished under Mr. Whitcomb's continued care. The parish's new procedures proved both practical and sustainable, and the inhabitants of Ravensbrück went about their lives with perhaps a slightly clearer understanding of what it meant to live together in community, with all the obligations and opportunities such living entailed. In the end, the stir that the letter had caused did indeed settle into peace, but it was a richer peace than had existed before, tempered by honest acknowledgement of imperfection and strengthened by the determination to do better. Which is, perhaps, the best sort of peace any community can hope to achieve, being built not on the pretense, the flawlessness, but on the humbler foundation of recognised fallibility and genuine commitment to improvement. And Mr. Whitcomb, standing at his usual place in the reading room on a warm June evening, looking out at the quiet street as the lamplighter made his rounds, reflected that Christmas, when rightly observed, did indeed ask for something more than spectacle. It asked for the courage to remember kindly, and having remembered, to act at last with both wisdom and compassion. Ravensbrück had answered that call, imperfectly perhaps, but sincerely, and that sincerity would have to suffice. Chapter 9. A Meaning Found Between the Lines. The transformation of understanding into action is never as simple as one might wish. There are always complications to be considered, sensibilities to be respected, and the delicate matter of moving a community from where it is to where it ought to be without provoking such resistance that the entire effort collapses. Reverend Monk had learned that the most profound changes often require the lightest touch, and that truth, however necessary, must sometimes be presented with such care that people can embrace it without feeling forced to do so. It was with this understanding that he approached the matter of addressing the parish. He did not rush to call an extraordinary meeting or issue pronouncements from the pulpit. Instead, he began with individual conversations, speaking first with Mrs. Perrin, then with Miss Shaw, then with Mr. Latchford and Mr. Garrick, and with each of the other trustees. In these conversations he shared what had been learned about Mr. Whitcomb's quiet intervention, about Mrs. Fletcher's letter of gratitude, and about the true nature of the Christmas request. He did so without accusation, simply laying out the facts and allowing each person to draw their own conclusions. The responses varied. Some felt immediate relief, for the knowledge that Mrs. Fletcher had not suffered complete destitution made their own role easier to bear. Others felt renewed shame, recognising that it had taken one man's private charity to compensate for their collective neglect. Still others felt gratitude toward Mr. Whitcomb, mixed with awkwardness about how to express it to someone who had clearly wished to remain unacknowledged. Mrs. Perrin, when she heard the full story, sat for a long moment in silence before speaking. She had come to the rectory at the Reverend's invitation, and she had steeled herself with that particular resolve which women of her generation had learned to employ when facing unpleasant truths. "Mr. Whitcomb did what we should have done," she said at length. "He saw a need, and he met it, without waiting for committees or deliberations. He simply acted." "Yes," agreed Reverend Monk, "though I think he would say that his action did not excuse the parish's inaction, but merely made it more bearable." "He would be right to say so," replied Mrs. Perrin. She smoothed her skirt, a gesture the Reverend recognised as indicative of internal struggle. "I have spent these weeks trying to understand how we allowed such a thing to happen, and I think I have arrived at an answer, though it is not a comfortable one." "What answer is that?" asked the Reverend gently. "We forgot because it was convenient to forget," said Mrs. Perrin. "Not convenient in any deliberate sense, but convenient in that remembering would have required effort and sacrifice. It was easier to let the matter slip away than to pursue it to its proper conclusion." The Reverend nodded, for this was understanding he had come to himself. "And what do you believe we should do now?" Mrs. Perrin considered this carefully. "We should acknowledge formally and publicly what occurred, not in self-flagellation, but simply as a matter of honesty. We should express our gratitude to Mr. Whitcomb, though I suspect he will resist, and we should establish some mechanism to ensure such oversights do not occur in the future." "I believe you're right," said the Reverend, "though the third will be most challenging, for it requires not merely good intentions, but sustained attention. "Then we must find people willing to provide that sustained attention," replied Mrs. Perrin, "and we must make it clear that such work is deserving of the respect we give to other important duties." Similar conversations took place throughout Ravensbrook in the days that followed. Miss Shaw spoke with Mr. Whitcomb directly, thanking him and apologising for the parish's failure. Mr. Garrick worked with Reverend Monk to review the parish's procedures for tracking charitable commitments. Even Mr. Latchford found himself acknowledging that changes were necessary. What emerged was not a single grand plan, but rather a collection of small, practical measures. There would be a dedicated register for all charitable commitments, with regular reviews to ensure promises were being kept. There would be a designated person responsible for following up on cases where assistance had been pledged. There would be a willingness to seek help when resources were insufficient. These were modest reforms, but Reverend Monk understood that lasting change is often built on modest foundations. Better to establish simple procedures that would actually be followed than to create elaborate systems that would collapse under their own weight. The formal acknowledgement took place on a Sunday in mid-February, when Reverend Monk devoted his sermon to the subject of promises kept and promises broken. He did not name names or recount specific details, but everyone present understood what was being discussed. He spoke of how easy it is to mean well and how much harder it is to do well. He spoke of the necessity of systems as safeguards for generosity, and he spoke of the quiet virtue of those who act rightly without seeking recognition. After the service, a brief parish meeting was held, at which Mrs. Perrin offered a formal acknowledgement of the promise that had been made to Mrs. Fletcher and the failure to honour it completely. She announced the new procedures for tracking charitable commitments, and she expressed the parish's gratitude to Mr. Whitcomb, though she respected his wish not to be singled out for special praise. Mr. Whitcomb sat in his usual place during all of this, neither seeking attention nor avoiding it, simply present as he had always been. When people approached him afterward to express their thanks, he received their words with characteristic modesty. "I did what seemed necessary at the time," he said to those who inquired. "Nothing more or less than what conscience required. The question was never whether I acted rightly in the past, but whether we will all act rightly in the future." That evening, February twilight settled over Ravensbrook and the lamps were lit along the high street. There was a sense in the town of something having been resolved, not perfectly perhaps, but sufficiently. The mystery that had begun with a letter's arrival at Christmas had been solved, not through dramatic revelation, but through patient inquiry and honest acknowledgement. And what had been solved was not merely the question of what had happened to Mrs. Fletcher, but the deeper question of what kind of community Ravensbrook wished to be. It wished to be the kind of community that kept its promises, that acknowledged its failures, that learned from its mistakes, that valued the quiet kindness of people like Mr. Whitcomb as much as the more visible contributions of its prominent citizens. These were good things to wish, and if the wishing was to amount to anything, it would require vigilance and effort and the recognition that good intentions, however sincere, were never sufficient by themselves. But wishes must begin somewhere, and Ravensbrook had made its beginning. Chapter 8. The kindness that asked for silence. There comes a moment in every process of discovery when scattered fragments of understanding suddenly arrange themselves into a coherent whole, and what had been mysterious becomes, if not simple, at least comprehensible. Such moments often arrive not with fanfare but with quiet inevitability, as though the truth had been waiting patiently for everyone to catch up with what it had known all along. For Mr. Whitcomb, this moment arrived on a grey afternoon in early February, when he was organising old correspondence donated to the reading room. Among the letters, he discovered an envelope addressed in a hand he recognised, though he could not immediately place where he had seen it before. The letter within was dated March of 1859, and it was written in the careful script of someone for whom writing did not come easily. It began, "Dear Mr. Whitcomb, I hope this letter finds you in good health and that you will forgive the presumption of my writing to you directly." As he read, understanding dawned with gentle insistence. The letter was from Mrs. Sarah Fletcher. She wrote to thank him for kindnesses he had shown during that difficult winter, kindnesses offered in such a way as to preserve his privacy. She mentioned small sums of money that had appeared with her landlady, always without attribution. She spoke of arrangements quietly made for her eldest child to receive instruction from a retired schoolmaster. "I knew it was you, Mr. Whitcomb," the letter continued, "though you never acknowledged it. You could not prevent the parish from failing to honour its promise, but you ensured in your own quiet way that we should not suffer the full consequence of that failure. When we left Ravensbrook, it was not in desperation but in pursuit of opportunity, for my sister had secured me a position, and we departed with enough to make the journey in dignity." The letter concluded with expressions of gratitude and the hope that perhaps some day she might be able to repay his generosity, though she understood such repayment might not be welcome, given the manner in which the help had been offered. Mr. Whitcomb set down the letter, with hands that trembled slightly. He had forgotten this, or rather, he had allowed himself to stop thinking about it. He had been unable to make the parish honour its collective promise, but he had been able to ensure, through his own modest resources, that Mrs. Fletcher and her children should not go entirely without support. He had done so secretly because making his actions known would have highlighted the parish's failure more sharply. It would have placed Mrs. Fletcher in the position of receiving charity that might be perceived as criticism, and it would have elevated him in a manner inconsistent with his understanding of what kindness ought to be. But now, with the letter's discovery, the shape of the entire mystery shifted. The letter that had arrived at Christmas had not been written by Mrs. Fletcher herself, for she had died some 3 years previous. Rather, it had been written by her eldest daughter, who felt it important that the parish should know both what had been promised and what had been left undone, but also what quiet mercy had been shown in the midst of collective failure. The daughter's letter, which Mr. Whitcomb now retrieved from the parish records, did not accuse or demand. It simply asked that Ravensbrook remember, and in remembering, perhaps find the courage to ensure that such oversight should not occur again. As Mr. Whitcomb sat with these 2 letters before him, he understood that he had been wrong about certain things. He had believed his silence during that winter had been pure cowardice, a failure that contributed to Mrs. Fletcher's abandonment, and there had been truth in that belief, for he should have spoken up at the parish meetings, but he had not been entirely passive. Unable to move the collective conscience of the town, he had acted according to his individual conscience, providing what help he could in the only manner that seemed both practical and honourable. It was not everything that should have been done, but neither was it nothing. This realization brought a complex mixture of relief and renewed responsibility. He had not failed completely, but neither had his partial success absolved him of the obligation to ensure that the larger failure was acknowledged and addressed. That evening, Mr. Whitcomb returned to the rectory with both letters. He found Reverend Monk at his desk, working on the next Sunday's sermon. "Reverend," he said, "I have discovered something that I believe will interest you." He presented the letters and waited while the Reverend read them, watching as the understanding transformed the older man's expression from puzzlement to surprise to something approaching humility. "You did this," said the Reverend at length. "You provided the support the parish had promised, even though doing so was not your responsibility." "I did what I could," said Mr. Whitcomb simply, "which was not everything that should have been done, but was something nonetheless." "And you said nothing," continued the Reverend. "You allowed us to believe we had failed completely, when in fact your intervention had prevented the worst consequences." "To speak of it would have served no useful purpose," replied Mr. Whitcomb. "Mrs. Fletcher needed help, not vindication, and the parish needed to understand the weight of its broken promise, not to have that weight lightened." Reverend Monk regarded Mr. Whitcomb with an expression of wonder. "You are a more complicated man than I had realized, Mr. Whitcomb. Most people, having done what you did, would have made certain that their virtue was acknowledged." "I chose to let the truth remain what it was," corrected Mr. Whitcomb gently. "The parish made a promise it did not keep. That is the truth." "But it changes what we must do now," said the Reverend thoughtfully. For the letter from Mrs. Fletcher's daughter is not asking for restitution. It is asking for recognition and for commitment that such failures should not be repeated. These are requests we can honour. They spoke long into the evening, planning what steps might be taken, what acknowledgements might be made, what changes might be instituted to ensure that promises made in the future would be promises kept. And when Mr. Whitcomb finally departed, the winter darkness had settled fully over Ravensbrook, but within those who had chosen honesty over comfort, there was the beginning of something that might in time be called redemption. Chapter 7. An Old Winter Reconsidered. The human capacity for memory is a curious thing, at once reliable and unreliable, precise in certain particulars while vague about others. Yet there are times when memory, having been prodded by necessity or conscience, begins to yield up what it had long held in reserve, and what emerges can be both clearer and more troubling than what was previously recalled. In the days following Mr. Hawes, Garrick's conversation with Mr. Whitcomb, it was as though a seal had been broken. Once the specific details had been spoken aloud, other details began to surface, not in the dramatic fashion of sudden revelation, but in the gradual way that fog lifts to reveal a landscape that had been present all along. It began with small observations. Mrs. Godwin recalled seeing a woman and 3 children at church one Sunday, poorly dressed despite the bitter cold, sitting in the back pews with that particular stillness that comes from having nowhere else to go. "I meant to speak to her," Mrs. Godwin said, with fair regret of one who has carried an unfulfilled intention for many years. But the service ended, and in the press of people leaving, I lost sight of them. Mr. Jenkins, who kept the general store, recalled extending credit to Mrs. Fletcher for basic provisions, credit which had been repaid after the first parish payment, but which had not been requested again. "I should have inquired," he said, "but one hesitates to press people about their circumstances. It can seem intrusive." Even Mr. Dawson, who owned the mill where Mr. Fletcher had met his death, found himself reconsidering events he had long ago filed away as settled. He sought out Mr. Whitcomb one afternoon with an air of discomfort. "The accident that killed Fletcher," he began, "it was ruled misadventure, and so it was. I paid for the funeral, Mr. Whitcomb, paid for a decent burial, and thought I had discharged my obligation to the man's memory." He paused. "But I have been thinking about Mrs. Fletcher and those children. At the time, I told myself the parish would see to their ongoing needs. It was convenient to believe this. It allowed me to feel I had done my duty without requiring sustained effort or sacrifice." "You are not alone in that convenience," observed Mr. Whitcomb gently. "No," agreed Mr. Dawson, "but being one among many does not absolve one of responsibility, does it? We all assumed someone else would act, and in the assuming we ensured that no one did." As these recollections accumulated, a picture emerged of that winter, which was both more specific and more damning than vague memories had allowed. The winter had been harsh, but not overwhelmingly catastrophic. The influenza outbreak had disrupted proceedings, but not prevented all organised response. What had occurred was simpler. People had made a promise, been briefly distracted, and then allowed that distraction to serve as excuse for abandoning the promise altogether. Mr. Whitcomb, listening to these testimonies, began to assemble a more complete understanding of his own role in those events. He too had been present that winter, newly employed as assistant to the parish clerk. He remembered Mrs. Fletcher, remembered the parish meeting, remembered the first payment being authorised, and he remembered the subsequent weeks when the outbreak had disrupted everything. He remembered noticing sometime in February that there had been no notation regarding continued payments. He remembered thinking that he should inquire about this, but he had not inquired. He had been young, junior in position, hesitant to presume he understood parish business better than his elders, and so he had noted his concern privately, but had said nothing aloud, and the weeks had passed, and by the time he thought to raise the matter again, Mrs. Fletcher and her children had left Ravensbrook. This memory sat heavily upon Mr. Whitcomb's conscience. He could not claim ignorance, for he had known. He could only acknowledge that he had chosen silence over advocacy, caution over courage, and that this choice had contributed to the abandonment of a promise. It was this understanding that led him one evening, as January drew toward its close, to seek out Reverend Monk at the rectory. He found the Reverend in his study, sitting before the fire, his gaze directed at the flames with that absent quality which suggests a mind absorbed in reflection. "Reverend," said Mr. Wickham, after the usual courtesies, "I wonder if I might speak with you about the Fletcher matter, and about my own part in what occurred." The Reverend set aside his book. "I have been expecting someone to say something of this nature, for I have come to the same realization myself. We were all complicit, were we not? Some through action, others through inaction, but all through our willingness to let the matter fade." "Yes," said Mr. Wickham, "and I think it is time we acknowledged this complicity honestly. Mrs. Fletcher came to us in need. We promised help. We provided it once and then forgot. She waited through a harsh winter for support that never came." The Reverend nodded slowly. "The question now, I suppose, is what we do with this acknowledgement. We cannot undo what was done. The past is fixed, Mr. Whitcomb. Only the present remains subject to our will." "Then perhaps," suggested Mr. Wickham, "the present is where we must focus our efforts. Not in attempting to justify the past, but in determining what honour and honesty require of us now." The Reverend looked at him with an expression that mingled surprise and respect. "You have a clearer understanding of these matters than I had credited you with, Mr. Wickham." "I have had occasion to think about these things," said Mr. Wickham simply, "and I've concluded that a town's character is not determined by whether it makes mistakes, but by how it responds when those mistakes can no longer be ignored." They sat together for some time after this, discussing what might be done, what should be done, and what obstacles stood in the way of doing it. And when Mr. Whitcomb finally departed that evening, walking through the cold January night, he felt a strange mixture of apprehension and relief, as people often do when they have decided to act rightly despite uncertainty about the outcome. Chapter 6: What the Town Chose to Mishear. There is a peculiar phenomenon which manifests itself in communities when a truth emerges that threatens to disturb careful arrangements. The truth is acknowledged after a fashion, but in the acknowledging of it, something essential becomes transmute. The sharp edges are softened, uncomfortable implications are redirected, and what emerges bears only a distant resemblance to the original matter. It is not precisely dishonesty, for the participants often believe sincerely in the revised version they have created. Rather, it is a form of communal self-preservation, whereby difficult realities are reshaped into forms that can be more comfortably accommodated. In Ravensbrook, as the second week of January drew to a close, this phenomenon could be observed with particular clarity. The letter had been discussed, the records examined, and conversations held expressing degrees of concern or regret. Yet somehow in the process of all this discussion, the essential character of what had occurred began to shift in subtle but significant ways. What had been a specific promise to a specific family became, in retelling, a general expression of support offered during difficult times. What had been a failure to follow through became an unfortunate consequence of competing demands and limited resources. What had been a widow waiting for assistance that never arrived became, through the alchemy of communal reinterpretation, a family that had chosen to seek their fortune elsewhere before the parish could complete its deliberations. Mr. Whitcomb observed this transformation with the quiet attention he brought to all matters of human behaviour. He did not comment upon it directly, for he understood that such observations would be unwelcome, but he noted how easily people can convince themselves that they have understood a thing when they have merely rendered it less troubling. The transformation was particularly evident in the conversations that took place at Mrs. Dalrymple's tea shop, which served as one of Ravensbrook's primary venues for the exchange of information and opinion. It was here that the emerging consensus about the letter received its most articulate expression. "I understand," said Mrs. Brennan, whose husband managed the corn exchange, "that the entire matter has been rather exaggerated. The parish made general assurances, as any decent community would, but there was never any specific commitment to ongoing support. Quite so, agreed Miss Hartwell, who taught at the Girls' Academy. One cannot expect the parish to maintain indefinite responsibility for every family that encounters temporary difficulty. And besides, added Mrs. Brennan, if the family was truly in desperate circumstances, they would have remained in Ravensbrook. The fact that they chose to leave suggests their situation was not as dire as has been implied. Mr. Shahas at Whitcomb, who happened to be present to collect a Parcel observed that each of these statements contained a kernel of reasonable logic, while somehow missing the essential point entirely. Had the parish honoured its word to a family it had promised to help? He might have said something to this effect, but he recognised that the ladies had gathered not to have their conclusions challenged, but to reinforce them, and so he accepted his parcel with thanks and departed, leaving them to their consensus. Yet not everyone in Ravensbrook found comfort in these revised interpretations. There were those whose memories remained stubbornly specific, whose consciences proved resistant to the balm of plausible explanation. Mr. Thomas Garrick was a solicitor's clerk, a man of modest position and retiring disposition, who had served the parish in various administrative capacities over the years. He possessed one of those methodical minds that takes particular satisfaction in accuracy and becomes distressed when records do not align with reality. It was Mr. Garrick who had maintained the parish minutes during the winter of 1858. When he sought out Mr. Wickham at the reading room, it was with an air of troubled determination, as though he had wrestled with himself regarding whether to speak, and had finally concluded that silence would be more burdensome than disclosure. "Mr. Whitcomb," he began after the usual courtesies, "I wonder if I might impose upon your time. There is a matter regarding the parish records that I feel compelled to discuss, and you seem to be the only person in Ravensbrook genuinely interested in establishing what actually occurred rather than what we might prefer to believe occurred." Mr. Whitcomb set aside his work and invited Mr. Garrick to sit. The clerk removed his spectacles and cleaned them with his handkerchief in that nervous gesture common to people preparing to say something difficult. "I was present at the parish meeting when the widow made her appeal," Mr. Garrick said quietly. "Mrs. Fletcher, her name was. Sarah Fletcher. She had 3 children, the eldest not yet 12. Her husband had died in November, crushed by a falling beam at Dawson's Mill." He replaced his spectacles and met Mr. Whitcomb's gaze directly. "We did not make a general expression of support, Mr. Whitcomb. We made a specific promise. Mrs. Perrin moved that the parish would provide 5 shillings weekly until Mrs. Fletcher could secure employment or other means of support. Miss Shaw seconded the motion. It was passed unanimously." "And was this promise kept?" asked Mr. Whitcomb, though he suspected he knew the answer. "The first payment was made. I recorded it myself, but then the influenza outbreak occurred. Meetings were postponed, and when we reconvened in February, Mrs. Fletcher's case was not among the matters discussed. I assumed someone else had taken responsibility for ensuring the payments continued." "But no one had," said Mr. Wickham gently. "No, one had," confirmed Mr. Garrick. "And by the time anyone thought to inquire, Mrs. Fletcher and her children had left Ravensbrook. I made a notation in March that the account could be closed as the family was no longer resident, but I did not note why they had left or where they had gone, or whether anyone had confirmed that they had found help elsewhere." He fell silent, his hands folded on his lap. "The others are speaking as though the promise was vague, as though we bear no specific responsibility. But that is not true, Mr. Wickham. We made a specific promise, we kept it for 1 payment, and then we simply stopped. Not because we decided to stop, but because we forgot." Mr. Wickham thanked Mr. Garrick for his honesty, and the clerk departed looking both relieved and troubled. As the afternoon light faded, and Mr. Wickham prepared to close the reading room, he reflected on how easily a town can choose to mishear what it does not wish to understand, but he reflected also on the fact that some people, like Mr. Garrick, possess a stubbornness of conscience that refuses to participate in collective self-deception. and he wondered whether these few stubborn consciences might prove sufficient to turn Ravensbrück toward honesty rather than comfort. Chapter 5. The Ease of Comfortable Conclusions. In every community there exists a natural tendency toward equilibrium, a gravitational pull that draws people back toward familiar patterns of thought and behaviour. This tendency is not born of malice or deliberate evasion, but rather from that human preference for certainty over doubt, for settled conclusions over the troubling questions. In Ravensbrück, as the days of January lengthened and the shock of the letter's arrival began to diminish, this tendency asserted itself with particular force. It manifested first in small ways. Conversations that had begun with earnest inquiry found their way toward reassuring endpoints. The uncomfortable gaps in the parish records were attributed to inevitable disorder, and the absence of follow-through was ascribed to circumstances beyond anyone's control. In short, the town began constructing a narrative that would allow its inhabitants to feel they had examined the past without requiring them to alter their understanding of themselves in the present. Mr. Henry Latchford, whose property interests had benefited in the years following the winter of 1858, found himself particularly inclined toward comfortable conclusions. He was a gentleman of substantial means and conventional wisdom, possessed of that confidence which comes from having always been fortunate. When Mr. Whitcomb encountered him at the subscription library, their conversation naturally turned to the subject that occupied so many minds in Ravensbrück. "You have been examining the old records, I understand," said Mr. Latchford, casually. "History has much to teach us, provided we approach it with the proper perspective." "Indeed," replied Mr. Whitcomb, "though I find that history often teaches us more than we initially wish to learn." Mr. Latchford smiled, the sort of smile that acknowledges wit without quite committing to agreement. "Yes, but we must be careful not to impose modern sensibilities upon past actions. Resources were limited, Mr. Whitcomb. The parish could not possibly assist every family that encountered difficulty." "That is undoubtedly true," agreed Mr. Wickham. "The question perhaps is not whether the parish could have helped everyone, but whether it helped those it promised to help." This observation settled between them with a weight that Mr. Latchford seemed to find mildly uncomfortable. He shifted the volume in his hands and cleared his throat. "Promises made in haste during times of crisis cannot always be held to the same standard as formal commitments. There is a difference between expressing general support and entering into a binding obligation." "Is there?" asked Mr. Whitcomb gently. "I wonder whether those who receive such promises recognise that distinction." Mr. Latchford's expression suggested that he found this line of inquiry somewhat impertinent, though his breeding prevented him from saying so directly. The family in question left Ravensbrück of their own accord. If they had been in genuine need of parish support, surely they would have remained and pressed their case. "Perhaps," said Mr. Wickham, "or perhaps they left because they concluded, after waiting through a harsh winter, that the promised support would not materialise." With this exchange, the conversation moved to other topics, but Mr. Wickham had observed what he needed to observe, that Mr. Latchford, like many others in Ravensbrück, had arrived at an interpretation of events that absolved all parties of significant failure. The promise had been conditional, the family had left, therefore no real obligation remained unmet. Miss Eleanor Shaw presented a more complex case. Unlike Mr. Latchford, whose comfort with his conclusion seemed absolute, Miss Shaw wore her reassurances with visible effort. She had devoted much of her life to charitable works, and the thought that she might have participated in allowing suffering to go unaddressed troubled her deeply. When she visited Mr. Wickham at the reading room requesting to examine the records once more, her agitation was apparent. She spent an hour poring over the ledgers, searching for some notation that would confirm the parish had fulfilled its obligation. "There must be something," she murmured. "Surely we did not simply forget. We were not cruel people, Mr. Wickham. We were not indifferent to suffering." "No one suggests you were," said Mr. Wickham softly. "But good intentions are not always sufficient. They must be followed by action, and action requires persistence even when circumstances make it inconvenient. Miss Shaw looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of gratitude and distress. "You're quite right. I have spent these days trying to persuade myself that we did all that could reasonably be expected. But reasonably expected is a phrase that permits a great deal of equivocation, is it not?" She closed the ledger with a sigh. "I recall the woman now, though her name still escapes me. She had a quiet dignity about her. She did not plead or importune. She simply stated her situation and asked what assistance the parish might provide. We told her to return in a fortnight when we would have made our determination." "And did she return?" asked Mr. Whitcomb. "I do not know," admitted Miss Shaw. "That is what troubles me most. I do not know whether she returned, because I did not think to ensure someone would be available to receive her if she did. We made her welfare contingent upon our convenience, and when she proved inconvenient, we allowed her to fade from our consideration." The pattern repeated itself throughout Ravensbrook as the days passed. Some, like Mr. Latchford, constructed explanations that justified past inaction. Others, like Miss Shaw, confronted uncomfortable truths. Still others occupied a middle ground, acknowledging that mistakes might have been made while insisting those mistakes were understandable. What united all these responses was a certain weariness, a fatigue that comes from being asked to remember what one has worked hard to forget. The letter had forced Ravensbrook to look backward, but looking backward offered no simple reassurance. Instead, it presented a mirror that reflected something more complicated and less flattering than the town's self-image. Mr. Whitcomb, moving through these conversations with his characteristic patience, understood that the town stood at a point of decision. It could choose the comfort of plausible explanations, or it could choose the discomfort of honest acknowledgement. The former would allow life to continue undisturbed. The latter would require something more difficult, a willingness to admit failure, and, having admitted it, to consider what might be done to address it. Which path Ravensbrook would choose remained uncertain, but Mr. Whitcomb suspected that the choice would reveal something essential about the character not just of the town but of all those who called it home. Chapter 4, Questions that Waited Their Turn. There is a particular art to inquiry which involves neither the bluntness of direct interrogation nor the evasiveness of complete silence, but rather occupies that middle territory where questions are asked so gently that those who answer them scarcely realize they have been questioned at all. Mr. George Whitcomb possessed this art to a remarkable degree, though the very nature of his skill lay in ensuring that no one paused to consider it. In the week following the arrival of the letter, Mr. Whitcomb found numerous occasions to exercise this talent. He simply made himself available, as he always had, to those who sought assistance or conversation, and in the course of making himself available, certain information came to light in the way that sediment settles when disturbed water grows still again. His conversation with Mrs. Perrin in the reading room had been merely the first of several such exchanges. She had departed with an expression of relief, as though speaking about the matter had lightened some burden. Yet Mr. Whitcomb had noted that her relief was not quite complete. There remained a certain tension, like a string that has been loosened but not entirely released. On the third day of the new year, Mr. Whitcomb encountered Mrs. Perrin in the churchyard where she had gone to place a wreath upon her late husband's grave. It was a bright morning, cold but not bitter, and the frost caught the sunlight in such a way that the churchyard seemed to sparkle with crystalline dignity. "Mr. Whitcomb," said Mrs. Perrin after they had exchanged pleasantries, "I have been thinking a great deal about our conversation, about the winter of '58, and about the responsibilities we bore then." Mr. Whitcomb waited patiently for her to continue. "I find myself remembering details I had quite forgotten," she went on, her breath forming small clouds. "Or perhaps not forgotten, but rather set aside as one sets aside things too difficult to contemplate when there are so many immediate concerns demanding attention. The mind has its own wisdom in such matters," observed Mr. Whitcomb gently. "Perhaps," allowed Mrs. Perrin, though I wonder whether what I call wisdom might be merely convenience. There was a woman, a widow I believe, with 3 or perhaps 4 children. The father had died in an accident at the mill. She came to the parish seeking support. I recall that we told her arrangements would be made, that assistance would be provided once we had consulted with the appropriate authorities. "And was assistance provided?" asked Mr. Whitcomb, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Mrs. Perrin's expression grew troubled. "I cannot say with certainty. The matter was to be discussed at a subsequent meeting, but then there was the influenza outbreak, and by the time we reconvened, so much time had passed that we assumed the situation had resolved itself. The family had left Ravensbrook by spring." "But you did not confirm this?" "No," admitted Mrs. Perrin, "we did not. We accepted the assumption, because it was more comfortable than pursuing the alternative." Mr. Whitcomb said nothing to this, for there was nothing that needed saying. Mrs. Perrin's acknowledgment hung in the cold air between them, and after a moment she drew her shawl more closely about her shoulders and bid him good morning, walking away with the measured steps of someone who's confessed a truth and is not yet certain what ought to be done about it. Later that day, Mr. Whitcomb found himself in conversation with Reverend Monk, who had invited him to take tea in the rectory. The Reverend's study was a comfortable room lined with books, warmed by a generous fire. "I confess I am troubled, Mr. Whitcomb," said the Reverend, stirring his tea with slow, meditative motion. "This letter has awakened something in the town, and I find myself attempting to preserve peace while wondering whether peace is what is actually required at present." "What do you believe is required?" asked Mr. Whitcomb. The Reverend considered this for a long moment. "Truth, perhaps, or at least a reckoning with truth. But truth can be disruptive, Mr. Whitcomb. It can upset the careful balance of relationships and force people to confront aspects of themselves they would prefer to leave unexamined." "And yet," suggested Mr. Whitcomb quietly, "might not the avoidance of truth be even more disruptive in the end? For a thing avoided does not cease to exist. It merely waits, growing heavier with time." The Reverend looked at him with an expression of surprise, as though he had not expected such philosophical observation from one whom he had long regarded primarily as a helpful clerk. "You speak with the voice of experience, Mr. Whitcomb." "I speak with the voice of one who has observed much and interfered little," replied Mr. Whitcomb, which is perhaps another way of saying the same thing. As their conversation continued, the Reverend revealed what Mr. Whitcomb had already begun to suspect, that the matter in question was not a simple case of administrative oversight, but rather represented a series of small decisions, each reasonable in itself, which had accumulated into a failure of collective responsibility. The promise had been made in good faith, but then circumstances had intervened. Resources had been stretched. Other cases had seemed more urgent. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the original commitment had been allowed to fade from active consideration, replaced by the comfortable assumption that surely someone else had attended to it, or that the need had resolved itself through other means. "We told ourselves," said the Reverend, with a note of sadness in his voice, "that we had acted as wisely as we could, that we had done our best given the constraints we faced, and in a sense this was true, but I wonder now whether our best was sufficient, or whether we merely decided it was sufficient, because the alternative would have required a degree of sacrifice and discomfort we were unwilling to embrace." When Mr. Whitcomb departed the rectory that afternoon, the winter sun was already beginning its early descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lane. He walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his breath visible in the cold air, and to anyone who observed him he would have appeared exactly as he always appeared, a modest gentleman of middle years, going about his quiet business with neither haste nor ceremony. Yet within him, as he walked, certain determinations were taking shape. He had listened, as he always did. He had observed, as was his nature, and now, having listened and observed, he understood that the questions being asked were not merely about what had happened in the winter of 1858, but about what kind of town Ravensbrück wished to be, whether it would be a place that confronted its failures with honesty, or one that preferred the easier comfort of plausible excuses. Chapter 3. Words read and words avoided. The days between Christmas Eve and the festival itself possess a curious quality in English towns where time seems to move both quickly and slowly. In Ravensbrück, this quality was particularly pronounced, for while outward preparations for Christmas proceeded with customary efficiency, there had descended upon certain inhabitants a thoughtfulness which made the usual exchanges of seasonal pleasantries seem somehow weighted with unspoken consideration. The letter, though read by only a small number of persons, had begun to exert an influence disproportionate to its size. This is often the way with such communications. A thing need not be widely known to be widely felt, for there exists in communities of modest compass a sort of atmospheric sensitivity, whereby disturbances in one quarter are detected in another without obvious means of transmission. The good people of Ravensbrück might not have been able to articulate why Mrs. Perrin seemed more preoccupied than usual, or why Reverend Monk's sermons had taken on an even more conciliatory tone, yet they sensed that something had introduced a note of complexity into the season's harmonies. Mr. Whitcomb, in his capacity as keeper of the reading room, had found himself positioned to observe these subtle shifts with particular clarity. The reading room served as a kind of barometer for the town's collective state of mind. In the days following Christmas, Mr. Whitcomb noted an increase in visitors who came ostensibly to browse the periodicals, but who seemed, upon closer observation, to be seeking something other than printed matter. Mrs. Godwin, the housekeeper, remarked upon it one morning. "There's been more traffic through these doors in the past 3 days than in the whole of November," she observed, "and a peculiar sort of traffic it is. Half of them come in, look about as though they've forgotten what they came for, and leave without opening a book. Mr. Whitcomb acknowledged this with a slight nod. He had indeed noticed the phenomenon and had formed his own theories regarding its cause, though he was not a man to voice such theories without considerable reflection. Among those who visited the reading room was Mrs. Perrin, who arrived on the morning after Christmas, under the pretext of returning a borrowed volume. She lingered near the desk where Mr. Whitcomb was working, and after several moments of silence, she spoke. "Mr. Whitcomb," she began casually, "you have been associated with the parish records for some considerable time, have you not?" Mr. Whitcomb confirmed that this was the case, though he had never held any official position. "Then perhaps," continued Mrs. Perrin, "you might recall the winter of 1858. It was a season of particular hardship." "I recall it," said Mr. Whitcomb quietly. "The river froze that year, and the cold persisted well into March. There was considerable suffering among those whose livelihoods depended upon regular work." Mrs. Perrin nodded. "The parish did what it could, of course, but resources are always limited, and decisions must be made. It is a heavy responsibility, Mr. Whitcomb, and one that often admits of no perfect solution." "Indeed," agreed Mr. Whitcomb. "One does one's best," Mrs. Perrin continued, with slight emphasis on the word best. "And if circumstances prevent one from achieving all that one might have wished, well, one must trust that intentions matter, even when outcomes disappoint." Mr. Whitcomb did not respond immediately to this, for he sensed that Mrs. Perrin was engaging in that peculiar form of conversation in which people speak not to elicit response, but to arrange their own thoughts in some order that will allow them to bear inspection. He had learned, over many years of quiet observation, that silence is often the greatest service one can render to those struggling with uncomfortable reflections. Later, that same day, Miss Eleanor Shaw appeared at the reading room requesting access to the parish records from the same winter. Her manner was less circumspect than Mrs. Perrin's, for Miss Shaw belonged to that generation of women who had been raised to believe that direct inquiry was more virtuous than artful suggestion. "I find myself troubled, Mr. Whitcomb," she said, once she had seated herself at the small table where such records were customarily examined. "There is a family whose name I cannot quite recall, though I remember their circumstances with considerable clarity. A mother and 3 children, if memory serves, the father having died some months previous. They came to the parish seeking assistance, and I distinctly recall promising that arrangements would be made." She paused, her fingers resting on the ledger before her without opening it. "But I cannot recall what became of them, whether we fulfilled that promise or whether in the press of other concerns it was somehow overlooked." Mr. Whitcomb, who had brought her the relevant volume, stood nearby with his hands clasped behind his back. "The records may provide some illumination," he suggested gently. Miss Shaw opened the ledger and began to read, her eyes moving slowly down the columns of names and notations. Mr. Whitcomb watched as her expression shifted from concentration to puzzlement, and then to something that might have been dismay, though she mastered it quickly. "There are gaps," she said at length. "Entries that begin but do not conclude. References to deliberations that were to be continued at subsequent meetings, but no record of those continuations." "It was a difficult winter," observed Mr. Whitcomb. "Many matters required attention." "Yes," said Miss Shaw slowly. "One wonders whether difficulty excuses oversight, or whether it merely explains it." She closed the ledger with a soft sound and sat for a moment in silent contemplation. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "We meant well, Mr. Whitcomb. Of that I am quite certain. We intended to help, but intention and action are not always synonymous, are they?" Mr. Whitcomb, who had spent much of his life observing the distance between what people meant to do and what they actually accomplished, could only acknowledge the truth of this observation. Throughout the town, similar conversations were taking place, though not all were conducted with the same degree of self-examination. Some residents, upon hearing vague references to an old parish matter, immediately concluded it must be a misunderstanding. Others suggested that without complete information, it was premature to draw any conclusions. A few, though they said nothing publicly, found themselves visited by memories they had not entertained for many years, and discovered these memories were less comfortable than the version of events they'd come to accept. Mr. Whitcomb moved through these days with his customary quietness, assisting those who sought information, listening to those who needed to speak. Yet those who knew him best might have observed that he carried himself with particular gravity, as though he understood that the questions being asked were not merely historical inquiries, but rather the first tentative movements of conscience, seeking to orient itself toward truth. Chapter 2. The Letter Delivered Out of Time. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned with that peculiar quality of light which winter bestows upon England when it is in a generous mood. The frost upon the ground sparkled with crystalline brilliance, and the breath of early risers hung in the air like small clouds of philosophical contemplation. At the post office, which occupied a corner of Mr. Thwaite's tobacco and sundries shop, the morning's delivery had arrived with its customary punctuality. Mr. Thwaite, a rotund gentleman whose cheerfulness was as reliable as the postal service he represented, was sorting through the various parcels and letters accumulated for distribution to Ravensbrook's inhabitants. There were the expected items, seasonal cards, packages wrapped in brown paper and string, and those official-looking envelopes which always seemed to arrive at the most inconvenient moments. It was while engaged in this sorting that Mr. Thwaite encountered something unusual. Among the ordinary correspondence lay a letter of quite extraordinary appearance. The paper was thick and creamy, with a texture suggesting it had been made by hands rather than machinery. The seal, though broken at some point in its travel, bore no recognisable device, and the ink possessed a depth of black that modern convenience had somehow failed to reproduce. What struck Mr. Thwaite most particularly was the addressee. The letter was directed not to any individual person, but to the trustees of Ravensbrook Parish, a designation which seemed to summon official responsibility without specifying who ought to bear it. The date caused him to adjust his spectacles and peer more closely, for the letter had been written some considerable time ago. How it had come to arrive this morning, having apparently wandered through the postal system for years, was a mystery Thwaite found both perplexing and somehow appropriate to the season. Being a man who understood the importance of such matters, Mr. Thwaite set the letter aside with particular care. By fortunate circumstance, Mr. George Whitcomb had been asked to assist with the holiday sorting. The reading room was closed for decoration, and Mr. Whitcomb, having time upon his hands, had offered his services to Mr. Thwaite, who was facing an unusual volume of correspondence. It was thus that Mr. Wickham, standing beside the counter with several bundles of letters in his hands, observed the peculiar envelope which had so arrested Mr. Thwaite's attention. He did not remark upon it immediately, for Mr. Wickham was not a man given to hasty observations, but something in its appearance caused him to pause. There was about it an air of patience, as though it had waited a very long time to arrive at its destination. The parish trustees convened that same afternoon in the vestry of St. Bartholomew's Church, a modest stone building whose tower had watched over Ravensbrooke for 3 centuries. The meeting had been scheduled to discuss Christmas charity, but these matters were quickly dispensed with when Reverend Monk produced the unusual letter Mr. Thwaite had forwarded to him. In addition to the Reverend, those present included Mrs. Perrin, overseer of charitable works, Mr. Henry Latchford, a gentleman of property, and Miss Eleanor Shaw, whose family had long been associated with parish affairs. Mr. Wickham, though not properly a trustee, had been invited to attend in his capacity as keeper of records. The Reverend broke the seal and withdrew several sheets covered in the same distinctive hand. He read in silence, his expression growing more thoughtful, then looked up with an uncertainty quite unlike his usual confident demeanour. "It appears," he began, choosing his words with care, "that we have received a communication regarding a matter from some years past. The writer wishes to remind the parish of a promise made during a difficult winter. They request not restitution, but rather ask only for acknowledgement that such a promise was made." A silence followed, filled with the soft rustling of thought seeking proper arrangement. Mrs. Perrin's brow furrowed slightly. Mr. Latchford shifted in his chair. Miss Shaw's hands tightened almost imperceptibly. "Might I inquire," ventured Mrs. Perrin, "as to the nature of this promise, and when it is said to have been made?" Reverend Monk consulted the letter. "The winter of 1858, if I understand correctly. The letter speaks of assistance to be provided to a family in circumstances of difficulty. The arrangements were to be settled by the parish, but the settlement appears never to have been formally recorded." Another silence descended. Mr. Whitcomb, observing from his position near the desk where parish records were kept, noted the expressions that passed across the faces of those assembled. They were not expressions of ignorance, but rather of recognition, struggling against the comfortable fog of time. "I confess," said Miss Shaw quietly, "that I have a dim recollection. There was a family who sought the parish's assistance. The name escapes me, but I recall discussion of providing support once certain arrangements had been made." "And were these arrangements made?" inquired the Reverend, gently but persistently. "I believe," said Mrs. Perrin with careful precision, "that circumstances intervened. The family relocated before the matter could be concluded. We assumed they had found assistance elsewhere." Mr. Latchford cleared his throat. "It would have been during my father's time on the parish board. I recall him mentioning that the winter of '58 was particularly harsh, with many calls upon the parish's limited resources." The letter was passed from hand to hand, each trustee reading it with an attention that betrayed a certain unease. The language was measured, almost formal, yet beneath the courtesy of its phrasing lay something that could not quite be dismissed as easily as one might dismiss a letter requesting donations or advertising services. It asked for remembrance, and in so doing it asked those assembled to look backward at a time when looking forward had seemed so much more convenient. Mr. P. Whitcomb, when the letter reached him, read it with the same careful attention he brought to all documents. His face revealed nothing of his thoughts, but those who knew him well might have observed that he held the pages a moment longer than strictly necessary, and that when he returned them to Reverend Monk, he did so with a gentleness that seemed to acknowledge the weight of what they contained. "Perhaps," suggested the Reverend, with the hopeful tone of a man seeking to restore order to a situation that threatened to become disordered, "we might make inquiries into our records. Mr. Whitcomb, would you be so kind as to examine the parish minutes from that period? There may be some notation which would clarify the matter and allow us to respond appropriately." Mr. Whitcomb inclined his head in quiet assent. The meeting concluded shortly thereafter, with expressions of seasonal goodwill that could not entirely mask the thoughtfulness which had settled upon the group like the first snow of winter, soft and concealing and capable of accumulating into something that must eventually be addressed.